with the New York Giants in 1 second. Tage, the Giants were featured on Hard Knocks off season. If you were in the GM chair and I'm an entrepreneuring television person and approach you to do Hard Knocks, what would you say? Are you immediately hard no on that?
I would lean towards no, definitely. I was surprised that the Giants actually did Hard Knocks because there's a lot of information, a lot of IP that you're giving out when you have, someone recording a lot of the moves and inner conversations you have. But I think that it can work under certain circumstances where you have someone who is really filtering out a lot of the stuff that you don't want to go out. You're having like what the Rams, I think, have had the last couple of years with Jordan Rodrigue being such a good reporter there, where they've given her a lot of information that they feel like they're okay with giving out while also keeping some of the stuff that they don't want getting out to themselves. And I think that you can definitely find a good balance with that. But where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying hard no, absolutely. I will say though, from a public perspective, I just want all the data out there. I want everything to be public. I want everyone to be able to have their view into really everything. So, obviously, I think the NFL can force teams to do it for regular Hard Knocks based on certain cycles. So if that happened, then yeah, I think the approach is, hide a little bit. Obviously, when you want to, I wouldn't be mad if you shed yourself in a good light. I think, you work hard and you deserve it if you're in that chair. So I think I would game that a little bit, but I agree with you that a lot of these teams actually on their own YouTube pages and things like that, like One Jets Drive, the Jets have one where they're kind of doing that. And of course it's going to be curated to be like pro them. And I'm not mad at that, but just having that inside access, having the feeling of kind of what's going around the building is pretty cool. So it just more content, Tage, more content. Let's get to the Giants offense. Tage, where do you want to start from a stats perspective there?
Yeah, so let's start with the Giants offensive line, where when you look at it holistically, since 2017 in individual seasons, there's 224 of them, the Giants had the fifth and ninth most pressure allowed in 2022 and 2023 respectively, like really, really bad pass blocking. But the one bright spot of their offensive line right now is Andrew Thomas, who is already one of the best offensive tackles in the league at only age 25. Timo Riske puts out a really good graph evaluating offensive tackles where he kind of shows the grade over expectation based on their assignment and who they're going against. And Andrew Thomas was someone who ranked 11th in that metric last year. He's one of the better offensive tackles in the league at pass blocking. And he's also a pretty good run blocker as well. So I think that even though the rest of the Giants offensive line really needs improvement, they have someone in Andrew Thomas they can build around.
Yeah, Andrew Thomas is a star, but the rest of the Giants offensive line certainly needs a lot of work. Tage, I was looking up some of the numbers yesterday and I was like, oh, the Giants pressure numbers are kind of middle of the road. And then I realized I was filtering for this preseason as opposed to last year. And then when you look at last year, they led the league in the amount of quick pressures, which is pressures allowed under 2.5 seconds and total quick pressures allowed. And they had a 14.1% sack percentage where only 3 teams were in double digits. And, their time to pressure on average actually was in the middle of the league. So I think this offensive line has a ton of issues, but there is a bit of quarterback responsibility in there. And Daniel Jones and Tommy DeVito both had a pressure to sack percentage above 30, and only 3 quarterbacks had that. You probably want to be half that number, around 15%, where the top quarterback every year is usually around kind of 10%. So Tage, how do we approach pressure from a responsibility perspective between the offensive line and the quarterback?
I love the stats that you threw out there, and they really show why some of the pressure is on the offensive line and some of the pressure being allowed is also on the quarterback, especially with respect to taking sacks when pressured. And I think that you have to do it on a play-by-play basis. It's really hard to do anything otherwise, where if you have either a coach who kind of understand the pass blocking protections that the offense is running, like they can help you point out on who the fault is in when there's a pressure. But I also think that there's also advanced tools that you can use, like neural networks that are trained on this past data that we have to really distill if the pressure and the sack was on the quarterback or on the offensive line.
I remember you, Haley English of the Lions, Eric Ear now the Panthers, and then Jeff Schwartz. You guys worked on something with offensive line training. You want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, Haley and Jeff and Eric did a lot of work there, and they were kind of working at offensive line shot mapping, where when an offensive lineman kind of goes into his pass set, the path that he's taking, and they found a lot of interesting correlations in that you can find on Twitter.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting one to look through just because it can kind of show, hey, if you want to be at a certain yard. Actually, I even thought about it from the defensive end where when you look at, all right, well, this player is setting in this at this specific point. Maybe if they're really targeting a landmark, when offensive line are setting, they're generally thinking about it on an angle, like, oh, I'm going to set it at 45. I'm going to like jump set, really attack the defensive end a little bit. Other than that, obviously, that happens less on the edge than it does inside. And, just a good tool. Just Tish, me, I'm always rooting for the combining of the stats and the data and the scheme. From the scheme perspective, I do think you have to find ways to maybe work around what you have, whether that's unfortunately just running more RPOs or kind of quick throws to avoid pressures. And you have Malik Neighbors, he was 7th in receiving yards after contact in college last year. So it feels like, that can be a player that you throw those underneath routes to and feel some of that hidden yardage coming through. And he was 2nd in the nation in explosive receptions, which is just 15 or more yards behind good old Rome Odunze. So I really hope that we get to see Malik Neighbors, where I think this receiving group is probably fine.
I do think so as well. I think that both Malik Neighbors and Darius Slayton can offer you something at the pass catching options where, you have Malik Neighbors who led the country in yards per route run last season at only 20 years old. He runs a very diverse route tree. So you look at that through StatsBomb and you can see that he really has a lot of routes available to him. And there were multiple teams in the league whose analytics departments had Neighbors as their wide receiver one when looking at their draft models. So he's someone that was thought of very highly across the league. I think you even had reports about teams trying to trade up kind of into that range, maybe for him, maybe for Brock Bowers. So you can definitely see that there was a lot of interest in him in the draft. And the explosiveness point that you mentioned, I think, is going to be key for this offense because it really seemed like they were missing that last year. And Darius Slayton, I think, going from a wide receiver one to a wide receiver two now is going to be beneficial for him as well, where he ranked 52nd out of 91 qualifying receivers last year in yards per route run, but he was the best receiver on the Giants. And even though the production was middle of the pack, ESPN's receiver score had him 35th. So that shows that he's someone who's good at getting open. He's pretty good after the catch. And I think that this role is going to be pretty good for him in the Giants offense as well.
Of course, we do have to realize that Malik Neighbors is a rookie, and for rookies to have these big, like 1,000-yard, 10-touchdown seasons is relatively rare. But I do agree with you that when you add in that new, hopefully top end player, and it allows you to kind of bump down other players, kind of maybe not just what's expected of them, but yeah, they can get more into their role. I do think that has downstream positive effects that usually we think of. All right, well, you added a star receiver. This changes so many things, but I think it can also make a lot of other people's lives easier. The Giants also added a star on the defensive side of the ball in Brian Burns. The defensive line is something that if we're going to talk about something on defense, I have to assume it's a defensive line. Where do you want to start from a stats perspective with the Giants defense?
You're 100% right. We do have to talk about the defensive line, and their defensive line better be good because if not, their defense is going to be in a lot of trouble. But I do think that it has the potential to be a top 5 defensive line because of the 3 main guys that they have there. You look at Dexter Lawrence at the interior, and he had a 15% pressure rate last season, which was the 5th highest in the NFL. He's a really good run defender also, and I think he's really established himself as one of the best defensive tackles in the league. And with Aaron Donald retiring, maybe he'll make a push for defensive tackle number 1, across the league rankings there. And I think that him getting paired with Brian Burns, who has shown multiple years of pretty good edge play. His production has dipped a little bit in recent seasons, but I think the one stat that really shows how lethal he could be on this defensive line was from Matthew Edwards at StatsBomb, where he showed the get off rate at which a edge rusher was getting 1 yard into the backfield quickly. And Myles Garrett led that stat, as expected, but Brian Burns was 4th with a 37% rate of getting into the backfield quickly. So I think that he's going to be someone that can also wreak havoc on this defensive line. And then you also have Kayvon Thibodeau, who's going into year 3. He had a big sack season last year, but was a little bit lower on the pressures, but you still have, someone who's very talented and developing well. So you have all 3 of these guys plus Azeez Ojulari, where he can be slightly underrated as well and really help this defensive line.
This unit has top 5 defensive line potential. I love the addition of Burns there. With Burns and Lawrence together, I'm picturing both of those guys on the same side. With Thibodeau, you hope he keeps rising, and that unit is going to carried the defense where new defensive coordinator Shane Bowen had some fun game plans against the Chiefs when he was in Tennessee, really based in cover one, rotate a safety to different sides, rotate him to Travis Kelce, rotate him away from Travis Kelce. And he dabbled in a bit of that kind of pre-snap, three high look as well last year. I think this is going to be a good example to track our kind of coverage versus rush conversation, because they're going to be able to get pressure this year. But I do think that people are going to be open.
Yeah, I agree. I think that their defensive line is really, really good. The linebacker and defensive back rooms are definitely going to need to see some improvement this year. You have your two outside starting corners that ranked 82nd and 87th in yards allowed per coverage snap last year. So you're hoping for some development there, but also just the typical cornerback variance that we like to talk about.